Economic, cultural, and religious differences. There was no shortage of reasons for tension among the people of the Virginia colony. However, the story behind the creation of our 35th state is a lot more complex than you might think. Here's the real reason West Virginia broke away from Virginia. Virginia was first formally colonized by the English in the early 17th century. The eastern part of the state was dominated by English tobacco farmers dependent on slave labor. The western part of the colony was settled by German and Scottish-Irish immigrants. Even after the American Revolution and statehood, Virginia continued to be a state with two identities. These differences were enshrined in the state's 1776 Constitution, which explicitly tilted power towards the east in terms of voting power, taxes, and public spending. The West's breakaway during the Civil War was a culmination of more than a century of cultural, political, and economic division in the area. We tend to think of events like secession in political or economic terms. Those certainly played a huge part in West Virginia's decision to break away from Virginia, but underlying those broad issues are the geographical features that caused them in the first place. One example is the Allegheny Mountain Range, which formed a natural barrier that allowed the western portion of the state to develop independently. It also impacted the types of crops that could be grown, tobacco being the most important. Another example is the natural flow of rivers throughout the area. After settling Jamestown in the early 17th century, the English didn't move westward, but instead headed north and south. See, 80% of the rivers in the western part of the state flow into the Mississippi River, not the Chesapeake Bay. As a result, tobacco farmers couldn't use the waterways to transport their crops for export. This lack of access to ports prevented their westward move. This also meant that the wealthy eastern part of the state, where all the political power was concentrated, didn't spend much in terms of infrastructure in the west. Improvements west of the Alleghenies simply wouldn't benefit power centers in the east, so there was continuous resistance to such investment, which led to deepening resentment in the western population. The area known as Tidewater, Virginia, where the original colonial settlements began, was almost exclusively English. Descendants of those English colonists established the large plantations and created the slave economy of Virginia. They also dominated politics and the economy. Just 5% of the English-descended families in the colony controlled everything. But the high-quality land in West Virginia encouraged enthusiastic land speculation, and most of the families that moved into the area didn't come from the east and weren't Anglican English. Instead, they came from the north, mainly Pennsylvania. Because the land in West Virginia is very different from the Tidewater area, the western economy had little to do with the eastern portion of Virginia. Instead, West Virginians largely traded with areas north of them, primarily Baltimore. As a result, western and eastern Virginia developed independently, setting up a deepening rift. The eastern part of Virginia was originally settled by English immigrants who were primarily members of the Church of England. The Anglicans came to dominate every aspect of Virginia. The Church of England was the official religion of Virginia until 1786, when the state adopted the concept of separation of church and state. In the western part of the colony, however, cheap land prices drew immigrants from a Protestant religious background. Many of these families had traveled to Pennsylvania to escape the religious intolerance back in England. In other words, they'd fled England to escape Anglicans and moved to a colony controlled almost exclusively by English Anglicans. That proved to be a good way to set up a future split. From its earliest days, West Virginia was different from the eastern part of the colony. The people of West Virginia were very aware of this, and long before the Civil War brought these differences to a final head, they were ready to break away. In fact, they tried to form their own colony in 1775. The idea dates back to at least 1763. In the wake of the French and Indian War, a group of influential Americans floated the idea of a separate colony formed out of land ceded by native tribes on the losing side of the conflict. The idea didn't take off, but after the Continental Congress was formed, residents in West Virginia tried again, sending a petition in 1775 asking that a 14th colony called Westlvania be formed. The 2,000 petitioners certainly thought big. Their proposed borders included not just what is modern-day West Virginia, but also portions of Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. These efforts were a direct result of the growing differences between the eastern and western populations of Virginia. The West's lack of political power made forming their own colony an attractive idea. The Continental Congress ignored the petition, and in 1783 ignored a second petition asking that Westlvania be made the 14th state. The tax code in Virginia before the Civil War benefited the eastern elites much more than their less affluent western counterparts. The code was designed to favor people who owned huge plantations and many slaves, which was only possible in the eastern Tidewater region of the state. Not only did this mean Westerners paid an unfair share of the taxes, it also meant the Eastern elites who controlled the government saw no reason to spend money in the West. As a result, the western portion of the state languished in terms of infrastructure investments. This lack of response from their government stoked the feeling in Western Virginia that they had to stage their own mini-American revolution to escape what was essentially taxation without representation. Many divisions pulled West Virginia away from Virginia, but one of the biggest and most important centered on slavery. There was a large abolitionist settlement in the western portion of the state. This was, in part, because there was a near absence of slavery in the region. This wasn't so much a moral issue as a practical one, however. The eastern plantation owners were heavily invested in slave culture and a slave economy, whereas the western part of the state was less conducive to the economics of slavery. When the abolitionist John Brown staged his raid on Harper's Ferry, today part of West Virginia, his main reasons for choosing that location were practical. Harper's Ferry was a federal arsenal filled with the weapons Brown thought rebellious slaves would need to fight for their freedom. Another reason was the emergence of a strong anti-slavery ideology. While this position against slavery wasn't necessarily a moral one, it suggested a friendly reception to the abolitionist movement. When the whole country split apart largely along slavery lines, it was natural for West Virginia to side with the Union. While slavery was a huge issue contributing to West Virginia's push for independence from Virginia, it wasn't necessarily an abolitionist moral stance. West Virginia wasn't so much anti-slavery as it was anti-slave owner. It was more about politics and morality. The wealthy slave owners of Eastern Virginia owned lots of slaves, and those slaves counted toward deciding how many representatives a county could send to the state government. The result was political dominance by the Eastern elites, making the western counties seethe. This resulted in a slow boil of resentment, as the East-dominated state government ensured that everything from taxes to infrastructure investments heavily favored the eastern portion of the state. Because their lack of slaves and property kept them trapped in a powerless cycle, Western Virginians couldn't do much about it. That is, until the outbreak of the Civil War offered them an opportunity to finally formally break away. This mostly political motivation becomes evident when you note how weak West Virginia's anti-slavery stance was once it became a state. Its constitution originally only freed slaves gradually, and many would have remained slaves their entire lives. It wasn't until 1865, 2 years after statehood and just before the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, that West Virginia officially ended legal slavery outright. The wealthy landowners that dominated Virginia before the Civil War were very much aware of the fact that Virginians living in the west of the state were unhappy. While they weren't much inclined to do anything about it, enough political pressure was brought to bear on several occasions to force them to at least try. The first time these efforts achieved any results was in 1816, when Western agitation convinced the legislation to establish some canal projects and banks in the west, but no significant political change came of it. The exercise was repeated in 1825 as reformers pushed for a revised constitution and received minor concessions instead. In 1830, things looked better for the West Virginians. The census had proved the population was booming in the West. This pressured the Eastern leaders to call for a constitutional convention. While the new constitution made significant changes to how power was distributed in the state, the balance of power was still tilted in favor of the old Eastern families. Most of the West voted against it as a result. It wasn't until a second constitutional convention in 1850 that real concessions were made to the West's growing importance, but by then it was too late. The obvious answer for why West Virginia split away from Virginia is always the Civil War and the issue of slavery. While that's certainly true, West Virginia's anti-slavery position was more about economics and power than morality, as was its decision to go its own way when Virginia voted to secede. When the Civil War seemed inevitable, Virginia's government debated what to do and ultimately voted to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. But the vote reflected the uneven balance of power in the state. 85% of the secede vote came from the wealthy landowners in the East, while 2/3 of the vote against came from the western counties. The West's inability to affect the secession vote was the final humiliation. Almost immediately, anti-secession conventions were organized in the western portion of the state in defiance of the state legislature. West Virginia was decidedly more pro-Union than the rest of the state, especially in the counties that bordered Maryland and Washington, D.C. The votes against secession were the last step towards statehood. Although it's clear that most of the people in Western Virginia were opposed to secession, anti-slavery to some extent, and tired of being under the thumb of the wealthy Eastern landowners, the population of West Virginia wasn't 100% in agreement. Politicians in the region moved quickly to call anti-secession conventions with an eye towards breaking away from the rest of the state, but the outcome wasn't guaranteed. The number of troops from West Virginia who committed to the Confederate Army shows just how contentious secession was.
But more recent scholarship has updated that number to about 20,000. So if you look at it that way, it has got to be the most divided state in the nation.
The final push may have come from the Union Army. General William S. Rosecrans moved quickly to secure West Virginia for the Union, driving Confederate General John B. Floyd out. West Virginia remained under the control of the Union Army from that point forward, with about 40,000 troops in place. While the troops weren't effective against guerrilla fighters in the mountains, the Army helped the nascent West Virginia government maintain control. It also helped to force statehood on their citizens. The Army's presence allowed West Virginian politicians to more or less declare statehood without ever needing to take a vote, and it's a vote that might not have succeeded. The Union Army also made it possible to include counties in West Virginia that didn't actually want to split away from Virginia, but the Confederate Army wasn't there to enforce their will. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.